second. Just double check. What did you call it? What did you call the YouTube show? Was it
Closing ceremony and the Inequality and Exclusion.
Okay. No?
So,
No?
When was that one? Or this one?
It's me?
Is that working?
No.
Such that. Yes, it is live.
So in order for the sound,
So, we're ready?
this one is connected to that.
Excellent, we're ready. Great.
I think so, yes.
Yeah, okay, perfect. Okay.
If you need anything, if you go to the post,
So that one we
for IT,
can do.
they can call me.
Which one do I need to...
I need this.
So yeah, you need to connect the sound from that laptop.
Or shall I hold that microphone like this?
Sit down.
So we need the
Shall we sit here or we stand? Any... How am I going to...
this one works. This one works. I think. Yeah,
Yeah, okay, so.
use that one.
Is it working?
Is it, or you have one more? Can you have any other one? What about the big one?
No, just that one.
Okay.
Oh no, is that working?
Yes. Okay. There we go.
Ah, okay.
All right. Okay, so we're ready?
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone, for your patience. We just had to get the text sorted, of course. So, welcome to the closing panel of entitled Inequality and Exclusion in the Face of Climate Change. It is a pleasure to be here at Pembroke College, and thank you very much. Chris is also here. Thank you, Chris. And yes, so to start, climate change never manifests in isolation. It intersects with many drivers of environmental and social hazards. Questions of attribution and accountability are always complex and often contested. And access to that knowledge and resources to tackle these many challenges has proved to be very complex. So this panel will offer an opportunity to explore and address the many forms of inequality and exclusion that shape the experience of climate change in different contexts of vulnerability, starting from the Himalayas down to East Anglia, and then where we go next. So next to me is Dr. Hildegard Diemenberg. She is the research director of the Mongolia and Inner Asia Studies Unit at the Department of Anthropology, of Social Anthropology, and she's also an undergraduate tutor, college lecturer, and director of studies here at Pembroke College. So Hilda, thank you very much, and I'll be changing the slides for you, so you let me know when you're ready.
Well, thank you, Antoinette, and thank you, everybody, for being. It's wonderful that we have a whole chain of events, in some ways, celebrating the engagement and the awareness about these great challenges that we are all facing, but also challenges that we're facing from very different vantage points. And perhaps one of the big lessons that we have learned is that when we often talk as the we, in terms of humanity, dealing with one of these existential challenges that is really staring us in the face, this we is actually much more fractious and disconnected and fragmented, so that far too often we operate with grand narratives in what we should be doing or the problems that we are facing as humanity, but actually we realize that we are made up of an infinite worlds that are actually talking to each other and sometimes not talking to each other. So the theme of inequality and exclusion, I think, is a very, very important one. And today, I think, I hope you can bear with me not being completely kind of coherent in a that I've just arrived from Western Nepal at the time in which this area has been affected by a massive expression of a monsoon that was completely non-seasonal. So normally during this month you would have blue skies. It's the prime tourist time. It's the prime crop time. But right now we have had massive rains, floods and snowfall in the mountains with unfortunately casualties and even fatalities. The count is kind of still coming in, trickling in. So, and yeah, hadn't I caught the forecast, I probably would still be somewhere snowed in. So, and this is somehow the theme which I would like to highlight, is the fact that knowledge matters, but there is an unequal access to knowledge and to resources to cope with what is already climate change in action. So it's not something that is about the future, it's also about the future, but it's also very much about the present. Next slide. So this is me saying farewell to the Himalayas on the way back.
Is this one?
Okay. Yeah. Looking at the papers in Kathmandu, where you saw bridges swept away, hydropower swept away, people displaced, and at the same time, this area has been affected in an unprecedented way by dengue fever, something that I had never heard of until a few years ago. And I've been traveling to the Himalayas since 1979. A variety of ways in which dramatic change is being expressed through unprecedented illnesses, through unprecedented meteorological phenomena, which people from different walks of life then interpret. They are attributed to climate change, sometimes they're attributed to disturbance of the spirits of the earth. It can be, the framework, the cosmological framework allow us to make sense of all this can vary, but certainly there is a widespread acceptance that something is not quite right. So this was actually on the BBC, the disturbance that actually created a lot of these floods and these snowfalls. The next one. And this is how it had started to manifest. The next images when we are going to see much more snow are going still to come in, because I have still students up who are trying to get out in some ways. And this is how it normally should be. So the crop basically was affected by the snow, and the question is how much of it is being destroyed and whether we're going to have famine in some of these communities. The next one. So the climate change hazards on the Himalaya have made a lot of headlines for a long time. We know about glacial lakes outward floods, the emerging of large lakes that threaten the communities downstream, problems of big snows as exceptional phenomena which are not entirely new but certainly much more frequent. Go ahead. And droughts. So basically what I'm going to show you today is simply some images, some impressions from that corner of northwestern Nepal, where we have been working with the local communities, trying to address challenges, also in light of rapid transformations, because on one hand, so Limi, this is the name of the system of valleys that we have been focusing on, whilst we have climate change driven hazards, at the same time we have rapid transformation driven by new connectivities, new consumption practices, a whole host of new things. Monastery in Nepal, which was established in the 11th century and which is now threatened by glacial lakes outward floods. And here we see a colleague of mine, Astrid Hofden, witness to one in 2011, which tore down houses and fields. And we see that, if this monastery has been here for 1,000 years, these new threats are really something that show that something is changing. And in light of these new challenges, actually ASTRID has assisted the community in terms of getting in touch with scientists and support organizations to try to create protections. But this comes with its own challenges, because actually this landscape is understood from very different vantage points. And the language of the glaciologist or the meteorologist may or may not be understood by the people living in this landscape. And in fact, it was very interesting for me to realize that I had the information in terms of weather forecast, detailed weather forecast, that enabled me actually to come out of the area before the onslaught of the cyclone that was coming in. But many people actually didn't have access to that knowledge, and actually there have been several, I was saying, fatalities and people caught up on the passage. So I think access to knowledge does matter. It can sometimes make a difference between life and death. So this is the glacier, so the basin of the glacial lake that created that flood. And here you see people trying to create, gabions of support of the village to try to avoid the next flood coming in and taking it away. The next one. Whilst practical measure of protection are important for people here, as important as ritual ways of addressing these threats. And this is very much part of what holds the community together, which is super important, in fact. Now, they feel that they can be rooted in this place also by addressing the spiritual forces that are actually shaping it. So ritual responses are very important. And here we see the village meeting that took place when there was glacial lakes outpost floods in 2011, trying to address these threats with our strategies. The next one. As I was saying, things are changing rapidly here, and since this year we have now kind of satellite phone connectivity, which means on one hand, there are new opportunities. People can actually consult weather forecast, and they still need to kind of learn better how to access perhaps a more reliable website and how to interpret them. But at the same time, it also brings in a new set of challenges in terms of consumption practices, in terms of how to deal, for example, with waste, new waste, non-compostable waste. So here we see images from Lee, one of the villages of Limi, with satellite dishes. The next one. And solar power panels. And here we see the first image that they had of a satellite photograph area. And this image was presented to them by the glaciologists. But it's also interesting that for the moment, it has larger symbolic value. There is not yet the interface to engage. And from that point of view, we have been increasingly engaging also with education, with working with the school, so that basically become shared of how to combine different forms of knowledge to understand this landscape and these hazards. One of the challenges that are coming in, and is also part of the fallout of the carbon economy, is new non-compostable waste. You can see the first trucks coming in from China with goods, and this leads to a lot of waste. And big questions around what are we going to do with not only plastic, but also toxic waste, e-waste. And that is one of the emergencies that the community is discussing right now, and trying to work in terms of environmental education and working with the schools so that at least the difference between non-compostable waste out and e-waste out is not straightforward. Next one. So this is the school, and I was saying, I just arrived now from this area, and apparently they have been so badly affected that there might be. So I'm glad I was there, because we were able to set in place at least some support for the school in terms of food. There are areas that, if the crops fail, it's hunger. The next one. So, making a big jump, this was one of the latest cases that we have been following in the Himalayas, but in the eyes a more global perspective. And actually, it's also this project in Nepal is just the latest of a chain of projects in which we have been addressing some of these environmental hazards, and especially climate change-driven hazards, from the perspective of different communities, and especially engaging the young generations, the ones that are more likely to be affected, but who also are very keen to learn from each other. And from that point of view, we have been also understanding global issues through local-to-local communication. And we have created partnerships between schools, say in Nepal, in East Anglia, in Mexico, in Alaska. Barbara is going to tell you more about that. And this has been a way of trying to promote a hands-on approach to some of these challenges that we all experience from our own vantage points, but where sometimes we are tempted towards despair because it seems that solutions are so far away. And just returning to my Libi people, it was very interesting how I perceived on one voices saying these villages are dying because people are moving away to go to Kathmandu, to have these extreme consumption-driven lives, which actually they realize doesn't make them particularly happy. But there is a young generation who says, no, actually, we need to engage with our place and our rootedness. So from that point of view, I think on one hand we have bad news, but on the other hand we have a lot of good news just in terms of the enthusiasm and the energy that is there and is prepared to engage in all possible ways. So this is the next step. But Barbara, to you.
Somebody could tell me when I'm halfway through.
Yes, that would be great.
I have way too much to say.
You want me to introduce you? You want to
No,
introduce yourself?
that's all right. I'll introduce you.
Yes.
No, you don't need to talk. My name's Barbara, and actually,
That's working.
this is working now. Can you hear me? Can you hear me if I just talk like this? Let's do that. In fact, there are 3 people in this room who've been working together on educational initiatives that I think are pretty unconventional. Hildegard and I and Jonathan were all part of what we call the Pathways Project. And I'll talk about that a bit, but I'm going to start earlier. Could we move to my...
Oh, yes.
Yeah, it's the second one.
This is it. Oops.
My pictures aren't quite as graphic. So let's go to the second one. So what I want to think about today is I want to think about what I consider to be vectors of exclusion. And some of that's about education and some of it's about extra education, how people do and do not recognize what other people know. So the first form of exclusion that I'm thinking about is what I consider to be exclusion from the world of recognized values. An awful lot of the guys that I work with know an amazing amount of stuff, but nobody recognizes it. And they don't recognize that what they know is actually something that is of value to others as well. But of course, and we're going to talk quite a bit about this, there's also the exclusion from the institutions that validate certain kinds of knowledge that get recognized as valuable knowledge. And in the case of what we've been working on, it's not what happens at Cambridge University, which I'm sure is the discussion of a lot of this stuff, but in primary and secondary schools. I want to think a bit about the strategies that both consciously and unconsciously suppress, diminish, or ignore voices. And in all of these cases, I recognize that these forms of exclusion may be self-imposed, or they may be very crudely imposed by others. But whether it's self or other forms of exclusion, the net effect is to cut people out of processes that are very crucial for the ways in which decisions can get made. So the next one. That's the midnight sun up in the Arctic. I've worked in the Arctic since 1980, rural Mexico since 2006. that particular picture was taken by a Mexican school teacher who was up there for the summer with me. So the last thing I want to take a look at, since this is a picture of an empty ocean, it's with a little bit of ice floating around in it, is I want to think about how it is that people discussed with me just before lockdown, in fact, what happens when the whales don't come. This is a whaling community. The whales don't show up. It is absolutely vitally anxiety provoking. Yeah? Okay, so 3 forms of exclusion and 1 form of opening out is what I'm hoping to do. So the first project really started when I was started in Mexico. I was collaborating with a woman named Laura Barraza, who was in environmental education. And she really organized a series of interchanges between 2 different Mexican communities of people who had collective patrimony in their own forests. They came together and were talking and working and thinking together. And at one point we were in a presentation made by a really impassioned expert on forest management who was talking about plagas. He was talking about the things that can affect trees. And one of the kids in the audience said, have you seen any evidence of climate change? And I have got to get these kids up to Alaska so they can talk with Alaskan kids who've never met a Texas taxi driver about how they were themselves engaging. So and thanks to both local educational institutions and to the National Science Foundation, we were able to organize face-to-face interchanges for 6 years. The manager said, no, we don't see any real difference. The last time I was there, in 2019, the guys that I was talking to said, well, we think we've lost about half of our insects. All right, if you think about mega biodiversity, the insect population makes up a really major portion of that. Okay, so that's in a relatively few number of years that you go from, when I first got to Ixtlan, it was a community of abundance. There was a lot of water. There was absolutely clean air. You put stuff in the ground and it grew. Now, all of those things are an issue. Okay, so how it is that people are seeing themselves, what sorts of processes are going on, is something that I think is actually very important to recognize. They lived together, they ate together, and they lived together, they ate together, and raced around on the beach together. Very, very good. Mexican kids probably had 100, maybe 500 English words. The Alaskan kids had probably 100 words of Spanish. I mean, we've been doing a lot, but there wasn't a lot of language in common. There was a lot of communication. So that was one thing, one unexpected consequence of this to come out was the extent to which these kids were absolutely dedicated to kind of trying to understand each other. And they continued. This was in 2011, 2022. A number of them were still, thanks to Facebook, are still in communication with each other. Okay, next one, please. So this is a very brief overview. They would work for 1 month in one place, and then the next year they went to the other place. That meant that all of the participants spent at least 1 year being a host and the other year being a guest. Very, very, very important. Some of them actually got to participate twice, and if they came back a second time, they came back on the condition they were mentors for other younger students from their own communities. So we saw this as a process in which people's knowledge folded onto other people's knowledge. Okay, so they did a lot of stuff. This is the guy in the center is Craig George. He's a whale biologist. They were out there actually on beach as well as in parking lots to actually engage more directly in the kinds of environments that whales live in. The next picture is the picture of a friend of mine butchering a bearded seal. Now, a lot of students have gone, oh, how can you show that? What I see with that is a woman treating this animal with enormous respect. Because the cosmology is that if you are respectful to the animals who are giving themselves up to you, they will come back. If you don't share, if you don't treat the body tenderly, if you are wasteful, you can see these guys. So that's one of the reasons I wanted to show this. This particular moment was a moment of enormous impact for a lot of the Mexican students who came up, because they were being asked to somehow rethink what they thought the relationship was. The Exclusion students kill a turkey and eat it. You know, do that all the time. Most of your diet is food that you have raised and killed in your backyard. But as some of these students said, yes, but this is a wild animal. It wasn't produced for consumption. And so that suggests a different morality. So these guys got into very, very heavy duty moral and ethical discussions about what their relationship was. And it's much, much more effective to have them talking with each other about that than me standing up in front of them. Okay, next picture, please. And then this is very interesting. People in all of the communities that I've worked value eating together. You know, the way you welcome people, the way you celebrate an event is to create food. These kids, these are all young Mexican, mostly girls. The girls are clearly more interested in the boys. But the ducks were ducks that had been hunted and brought in. The event was going to be a meal that night, and they just had to learn how to prepare. And the teacher, as you can tell, was Martha Stackhouse, was very attentive to how it was that this young Ixtleca woman was learning how to cut up a duck so that you'd make soup. Okay. So in Mexico, you learn different kinds of things. Let's keep going. I'm going to be running out of time really soon. So every single day, they had to start the day by talking about something that they had come in contact with the day before that they didn't understand. And they had to talk about how they were going to try to clarify it during the day. On a weekly basis, in order to get their $10 of walking around money, they actually had to produce either a new word or a new concept and talk about it. That generated such discussion. So for instance, the question about whether trees could migrate or not was a very, very hot topic, because a boreal ecologist, Glenn Day, talked about trees migrating all the time. Whereas the Arctic ecologist in Barrow said, no, trees don't migrate, only people migrate. I mean, only animals migrate. The whole question about what you do with wildfire, again, very, very controversial, totally different approaches, a lot of discussion. And then once during the project, they had developed a research project and then had to present that not just to each other, but to the public. Okay, next one. So unintended consequences that go straight into what I'm talking about in terms of these vectors of exclusion. Pretty much all of the students were explicit that they felt differently about their own community at the end of this than they did at the beginning. And some of them were, I mean, one of the young women said, yeah, no, I never knew that Barrow was actually Board for Science. How cool is that? She said, and I asked if I could quote her, she said, yeah. But also, and this surprised me because of my own education, that the numbers of students who said what they got from this was this chance to argue, was the chance to discuss. And I was going, well, don't you do that in school? So absolutely, that was one of the really serious, I think, outcomes. And just the extent to which long-term relations were facilitated by Facebook. Yeah, back last time I was in Barrow, 2019, just before lockdown, I sat with one of the young women who now has 3 kids, and we talked to one of the woman who actually said how cool is it that Barrow is a subject of science, that they had been in contact for 20 years. Neither of them is really fluent in the other language. Well, what Facebook does is to allow you to share pictures and music and just emojis, yeah. So that is a very real thing. Okay, next. Now, for me, when I was talking about institutions, this is some of the most important outcomes. In all of these communities, I'm not so sure about rural East Anglia. In all of these communities, the dropout rate is ferocious. Yeah? That for the most part, again, when I was there in 2019, I was invited to take part in a middle school graduation because the teacher who invited me said, most of these kids aren't going to be here by the end of secondary school. So we give them a really big graduation at middle school so they have something to remember. And as a matter of fact, about 50% of the students who start middle school do not finish secondary school. Of the kids who actually do finish secondary school, only about 10 to 20% will try to go on to further education. 50% of them drop out by the end of the first year, and a further 50% will drop out before the end. So if we're thinking about these formal institutions being a source, a vector through which knowledge is validated, the extent to which these kids either themselves drop out, which is a form of self-imposed, or are told by teachers they shouldn't really bother because they're just going to be farmers when they grow up, is a very serious vector. So, of the participants of these interchanges, nobody dropped out. All of them finished high school. A serious chunk of those who finished high school not only started but finished university, and some of them are now doing graduate school. So as far as I'm concerned, this is a serious win. Sociologically speaking, you could say that, well, maybe these guys are self-selected. And I'm sure to some extent they were, you know, they wouldn't have applied to do this if they weren't engaged and hungry, but not at the level of those numbers. Okay, thanks. So next. So this Pathways project was a virtual one. I did, with the high school students, I took them, and I probably lost 10 years of my life every year just handling with the process of getting visas for them. But with the next project, we did it virtually. So we had students from East Anglia, from Mexico, from Nepal, from Alaska, and Mongolia, not contacting everybody, but we paired them up. And they spoke with each other, had Zoom conferences where they could sing to each other. And in this particular case, the kids from SOAM had sent some football t-shirts, which were very gratefully received by the part of these kids. But they also ended up doing a lot of activities on their own. So next one, please. Every community, kids took walks that they guided us on. They said, here are the places that are special to us, and this is why they're special to us. So we've got muddy paths in East Anglia. What you see on the beach here, we were doing an experiment in sort of sense around, and kids were being blindfolded so they didn't see, because so much of perception is sort of sight dependent. This young man who's an Anubakwela and a scientist had dipped a stone into, what you see at the front is sort of a rotting walrus, and he dipped a stone into the eye socket and said, here, smell this. He's a very brave young man. But what we were trying to get them to do was to really think about, through the questions of their co-students, what was it that they were hearing, what did the wind feel like on your cheek, that kind of stuff. And that they really enjoyed that a lot. Next one. And here you can see this. Marianne Leaper is an extraordinary storyteller, and she was in one of these Anglian schools and clearly engaging with these students, getting a very strong response. Next. As well as an archaeologist. Next. And this is quite nice, because one of the years of our pathways, the teachers had gone on strike. And they were absolutely in their rights to go on strike. I support them entirely. But the young woman you see was one of our interchange students from Ixmani. And she, during the time of the strike, was engaged with these kids while they were learning local dances. There was another interchange student who actually took kids out so that they could learn about curative plants, and another one helped them write a play about the foundation of their community. So the overlap between the kinds of things that the interchange students learned and the kinds of ways in which they were sharing that with local kids who were not able to travel was fabulous. The teachers came here for a workshop, and they ended up publishing in the Journal of International Environmental Education accounts of what they learned, what they got from the interchange, from this pathways, which meant that they had a publication to put on their CVs, which was a series of points to them. Okay. So this is fall coastal erosion. Next one, which is becoming more and more extreme. Next one. Permafrost. So the one thing, should take me about 2 minutes, I think. Can we see the whale?
Sorry.
The whales that people hunt are bowhead. And bowhead travel completely predictably along the coast in 2 directions. So Barrow, which is at the center of the northern coast, actually has access to them twice a year, like clockwork. Except in 2019, they didn't show up. They were in Kaptovik on schedule. They left Kaptovik on schedule. Next one. So the question was, how come? And this is what I think is actually really very, very interesting. I'm hoping we can open this out a bit. So I only talked to young people. I wasn't talking to elders I was just talking to young people who were involved in whaling. And I got all of these different sorts of answers. We were too greedy last year. So of course the whales decided not to show up. During the Trump administration, you can't do seismic testing within a 5-mile limit of any whaling community. But the bombs had gotten bigger, which means they're louder underwater, and they've gotten much more frequent. So people said, well, maybe it's the seismic testing was making too much noise. The whales start here, they just hang a right and go under the pole and keep going. But also, because the ice is shifting away, there's a lot of shipping, whether it's cruise ships or it's just cargo ships, has intensified. Maybe that's what scared them away. But maybe it was us, one of the people said, because so many elders had died the previous year, the young people who were stepping in to become whaling captains didn't have the experience of the elders. They had money. And they thought it would be a good thing to use that money to get these huge, almost yacht-like whaling ships. But they're also really loud. Whales have such sensitive ears. Those of you who know any marine biology know that one of the things that noise pollution does to marine animals in general is it breaks their eardrums. I just can't stand the idea of it. But that's also so the guys that I was talking with are very, very aware that noise is a factor that can drive whales away. And that the only thing that was sort of straight climate change stuff is people thinking, well, maybe the changes in the ocean means that the food supply wasn't the same. And so that whales changed their route to do that. In all cases, I'd say, the thing that I want to really emphasize that is all cases, what the people I talked to assumed was that it was the whale's decision. That for the most part, that decision was a reaction to what humans assumed whales perceived as human action. Yeah? So this is just my last thought. For me, what was really striking as I was listening to these conversations was there was not a struggle over truth. There was not a fight about whose explanation was right. That there was a lot of recognition that this was speculation, that this was uncertain, that it was absolutely critically important to try to come to some idea about but you weren't fighting to get your idea dominant over other people's ideas. All of them assumed that human action was a core factor. There wasn't any sort of human denial of, well, what can we do? I didn't hear that once. They were absolutely happy to draw on whatever knowledge sources they had. There was no privileging of one kind of knowledge, whether it was elder knowledge or scientific knowledge or knowledge of the way politics works. So my final question to you guys is whether or not we might not think about how to draw on that kind of openness as we're thinking about the sorts of issues that are confronting this audience today, which is not the same as the disappearance of whales. Thank you.
Where's the microphone?
Oh, got it here.
Thank you. Oh, excuse me. Thank you very much for both of your talks. And I think the best way we can actually interact is asking if anybody has a question. Plus, my voice is almost gone, so that makes life easier. So, does anybody have any question for Hilda? Or questions? No? Somebody in the back? No? Okay. Well, I would say that to ask Hilda first, to perhaps to develop a bit more the work with the schools and how both of your collaborations has actually worked. I think that would be very interesting for everybody to know. So.
Thank you, Antoinette. And yes, in some ways, privileging the schools and generally the work with younger generation is correct. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Was almost a spontaneous outcome, realizing that some of these big challenges very often are addressed, kind of whack-a-mole approach, in a sense that there is a big emergency here, address it, sort out the problem, but actually underlying all these big challenges is actually the question of enabling younger generations to open up to a dialogue of knowledge across different experiences. And from that point of view, then precisely setting different groups of students, young children and also less young children in communication with each other was a very, very fruitful way of operating with an idea of education that was not curriculum-driven, problem solving, about addressing issues and also participating in the issues of others with whom you can kind of empathize, feel together. And from that point of view was really, really important. And that, I think, was a big lesson that we all learned in working with fantastic groups of students who, in many ways, taught also us how they understood the problems and also how they were struggling themselves against being driven down a simple kind of pessimistic route towards apathy, towards let's live for the day and it's too late anyway. So in many ways I think perhaps what was the most important lesson was really draw on the energy and the creativity of these different children who could talk to each other and develop strategies. Very much as Barbara was saying, also developing different ways of coping with uncertainty. And I think this is so important because it's far too easy to suddenly become simply pessimistic. It's too late anyway. Whereas actually there are potential solutions that are hidden or that we haven't discovered yet, but they are there. And I think, so working with school has proved to be very, very important. And I think this is very practical also. So the pairing of schools, working with assemblies, developing together teaching materials, also creating examples that then can be picked up elsewhere. So from that point of view, I thought working with children was a good way of moving also beyond the siloed knowledge that very often our disciplinary academic activities lock us into.
Just a really quick comment about that is that in the East Anglian schools that we were in the Alaskan schools and in the Mexican schools at the very least, the teachers welcomed this project because they themselves were so locked in to government requirements around curriculum that all of this was presented as extracurricular stuff. So they recognized themselves that this was really important, and they were pleased to see the students getting access to it, but it didn't interfere with the things they needed to be doing on a Thursday afternoon. Nevertheless, what we tried to do was work with them about how this material would meet certain of their curriculum goals. But I can't emphasize how much teachers feel trapped. Yeah.
My voice is quite loud, so
Okay, good.
okay. It's recognizable to me. I spent my paid working life, and I'm thinking, how does the fact that we're in the end of the end game affect the way in which we use? So, I mean, yesterday I spent 5 hours for what it's worth, I spent 5 hours in Islington, because I know knowing it was something, and so as a result, I think things have to change dramatically in our sight. I mean, I've handed around leaflets, you may have not.
I would like to say that I've got fabulous students who are doing fabulous things around the world. That doesn't count in this university as a contribution to knowledge. So if you publish, you're contributing to knowledge. If you get students who are doing really crazy things, that doesn't, and that's an institutional change that has to happen.
I can see how, that somewhere at the end of the end game, I can see that this, it's possible that this is where we are, but actually it's possible that's not where we are either. The way that these kinds of interdiction is based on the knowledge that we've accumulated, so historic evidence, right? And then with what has happened in the past, we try and make some prediction about what is going to happen in the future, but actually, right?
There is a range, there's a mountain range media, and the glaciers are disappearing, but that's an out, you know, and that's us.
Yeah, that's
It's
not,
not them, it's us.
so that's us, but this, how we're going to tackle it is that you get all these people to disrupt the systems that exist, when actually the systems that exist are the only collective act. You know, collective action requires organization. It requires organizations. It requires systems. It requires, and so these systems have a certain stability to them that's not determined by the leader of the system. It's like the system itself has a life of its own, right? And so the way that you disrupt these organizations, right, if you completely destabilize and you completely disrupt it, it has no organization to tackle anything. So it's the same, you know, so I think when you go for these changes, these internal changes, and I think that's what you're talking about, sort of cultural shifts, right, to tackle these problems.
Certainly at this university, yes.
Yeah, so there's a speed at which you can do that and maintain.
No, that used to be the way we planned things. But now, there are logical limits which determine the speed at which we have to change it. It's changed. Everything's changed.
Yeah, so there's a chance that your ecological limits just mean that you never organize to solve
Excuse me.
the problem, right? Just descend into
Okay.
chaos.
Excuse me. Sorry. Perhaps somebody else has a question. You can continue that afterwards. Yes. Yeah. Yeah, and then we go to next.
I can probably talk loud enough as well. A couple of comments listening to both of you speak. Really interested to talk about the access to knowledge. So I'm talking in a little while, I'm going to be talking about the work I do in Cambridge, but it's the same but different around the world. It made me think, because many of the people I work with in Cambridge that are living with fuel poverty are struggling because of their lack of access to knowledge throughout their lives. So that's just one thing I wanted to comment on. And when you were
But you did mention within the communities they are, like young people are coming up with strategies and things. And I was wondering what kind of management strategies they use and how they integrate with technology. Like how can
recording stopped
in these communities who are rural, how can technology to help them?
Thank you. This is a very good point. And in fact, this particular corner has had a complicated, actually, history of conflict between the people who have remained up, who were considered to be the poor people, and the elite who had basis houses in the plains as traders, who were able to move out And then there was a lot of actually conflict between the different parts of the community. But right now there is a new young generation people who have developed a cooperative trying to the different elements in the community to develop forms of, I would say, sustainable enterprises in the area, promoting connectivity, promoting healthcare on site, so that people have incentives in staying there, and also really there are opportunities to rethink basically the local economy. Perhaps also with culturally sensitive, limited amount of tourism, rather than having certain groups of Indian who come, go past, look at Mount Kailash and get shuttled out by helicopter. So what I'm saying is that there is a really interesting kind of engagement, and the technology, I think connectivity, the internet makes a huge difference. And also mobile phones. An area where even in 2018, in order to go from the district capital, which in itself is not connected by road to the capital of Nepal, you have to walk a week. And there was no mobile connectivity then.
Hi everybody.
You have to stop.
Poor Antoinette has completely lost her voice. So we're now going to have a tea break for 10 minutes, 15 minutes. So 15 minutes to get tea and to have to continue some of these fascinating conversations that we've already started. So
on the end of the table are 3 books that have been recently published about climate that are people connected to the problem. Just have a look. Okay. One of them, Michael Bravo, I think was involved. Is involved in different project of ours, but just have a look.
It's ridiculous.
That mic is also switched on. Maybe
Yeah.
that must be switched off.
So yeah, that was what I was.
Because it could be that as well.
So is that better? Thank you so much.
Thinking that switched on.
It was bothering me so much, and I was like, I did. Anyway, I'm gonna put that there.
I'm wondering if you can hear me.
Recording in progress.
should I start calling people back?
A couple of minutes. So maybe start the video and then say oops.
Antoinette, I can see and hear you now. Can you hear me?
Can you hear us?
I can hear you. Can you hear me? You can. Marvellous. Can you hear me now?
Say this is the next person. These things.
Is that good?
Yeah.
Emily, can you say something, please? Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Are we on time? Are we on time? Yeah. Yes. Okay. Fantastic. So, all right. Okay. Now, fantastic. Okay. 1 second, Emily. We're just gonna sort out. Gather everybody now that we got it sorted. All right. Yeah.
Do you need anything else?
No, because and then once that's finished, we can go to the slides again.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yeah, you can just open PowerPoint and issue.
Okay. So would you mind sticking around for the just in case I'm just nearby? Or are you gonna call me? Just call you.
Yeah, you can call. I mean, I put someone else's PowerPoint on there.
All right. So good. Okay. All right. Yeah. Yeah.
But yeah, you can just bring.
Hi everybody, we're about to start, so if everybody wants to take their seats, that'll be great.
So we have Emily. Okay. All right. Okay. So we have Emily. So yeah, just one. And then sorry. And then you want to sit here? If you want to introduce Emily. You can introduce yourself. Okay, microphone.
Okay, so we're going to do Emily first.
Yeah.
I can project, it's okay.
Can you? That
Does
that
it work?
works.
Does
Yeah.
it work?
Over to you.
Hi everybody, I'm just going to step in for Antoinette because she's losing her voice after lots and lots of days saying lots and lots of words. So our next session we have Emily Rose speaking. Emily speaks in her individual capacity as an experienced solicitor working in the human rights field with a history of representing asylum seekers and currently a senior legal officer at the NGO Freedom from Torture, where she supports clinicians producing expert evidence for use and protection claims. Concerned about the climate emergency, she has benefited from insights from the Oxford School of Climate Change and studied this September with the United Nations Human Rights Council training programme. Emily has recently been a panellist at the Institute of Advanced Legal Studies WG Hart workshop, starting to explore how asylum lawyers can rise to the challenge of assisting climate refugees. Over to you, Emily.
Thank you, and thank you everyone for including me, but also battling with the tech to enable me to take part.
I hope you can hear me all right.
Yes.
Okay, good, marvellous. My take on inequality and exclusion is to do with asylum and asylum explanation to climate change. So people who seek refuge for issues that are to do with climate change and disaster. And at the moment, definitely there are issues about exclusion with them from our normal refugee and human rights models that they're developing, as I hope to show you. So, sorry, I don't seem to be able to change my slides.
Okay, that's.
One second should be right on screen. So.
Sorry, I don't seem to be able to.
There we go.
Okay, phew, that was lucky. So yes, this is what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to make accessible some information out there. I was very interested in what previous speakers said about siloed information and us sharing, open to other information. So I've noticed a lot of information that's in academia or in the UN system that may be outside what those of us who practice asylum are aware of, and it's very helpful to put all these things together. So I'm going to have a look to start off with how we might frame the issues, so why these issues are relevant to seeking asylum, and then introducing some ideas about how the Refugee Convention and human rights can be relevant, and then how you might put them together to make a case. So to start with the framing, we're going to have a look at these few issues about climate change itself and disaster and migration, and how that relates to our area of asylum and climate justice. I think we probably all know what climate change is, we think, and certainly it's one of the key issues of our time, and the key points for our relevance for asylum is that we have human activity driving greenhouse gases, but also that that causes adverse weather events, which then link to disaster. And I think one of the reasons why people think that asylum isn't relevant to environmental issues is that they think that those kind of extreme environmental issues aren't really anything to do with human interaction. But in fact, that's not what those who are experts in that area think. So if, for example, if you look at what the UN Office for Disaster Risk Reduction defines disaster, they put inverted commas over that word natural and say instead that what it is the combined result of exposure to a natural hazard, but with the affected communities' adaptive capacity based on their existing vulnerabilities. So that I think you see immediately how the social impacts on the environmental. And there are some other definitions that you can see here, where disaster is a serious disruption of functioning, and also how it can link to different types of natural hazards. And the way that climate change fits into that is essentially it's an intensifier, so it's not a thing of itself, but it makes those kind of disasters that we're aware of worse. It makes them happen more often and it makes them last longer. And again, when we think of disasters, we think, okay, so there are disasters, and I get that there's a human element, but isn't everybody affected in the same way? And one of the key things you may realise in relation to refugee status or human rights protections is that you need to see some kind of selectivity. And in fact, that's absolutely what does happen with disasters. So if you look at the, for example, the UN Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, they talk about their research with disasters particularly affecting the poorest and most marginalised people and exacerbating vulnerability. And here we see what the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights says, and giving all those different examples of people that are in categories where they are more vulnerable to this kind of harm. And just one example here from the UN Development Programme. Here it found that more than 4 times more women than men had died. And I was very struck looked like it was quite a similar situation. And also people were dealt with differently afterwards. So it's all about the preparation for the disaster, but the disaster itself went on. If we understand more about and how it discriminates against people, then we need to go on to think in the area of asylum. So what's that got to do with human movement anyway? Actually, it's got quite a lot to do with movement. This is what the World Economic Forum has to say about it. So they talk about how it's going to be the greatest challenge of our era, and something that will specifically impact fragile states. They give these kind of numbers, so in the many millions, of people needing to leave their homes. I've just given some example here of an organisation called the Climate Migration Coalition. If you're interested in following up these issues, they've got some good resources. And here we see some statistics from the UN International Organisation for Migration. And I think this first one, this first comment is not a statistic, is just saying how in any given year, many more people are newly displaced by disasters than those by conflict and violence. I think we might all be quite surprised by that. Though the thing to note from my perspective in talking about asylum is the vast majority of those who are displaced internally in their own countries, and they're not coming here, and also the people who are external stay in their region, mostly. So, although definitely, as I hope to show, we do get some people here, and this is still very relevant, as with most other categories of asylum and people seeking protection, most of them, I think, don't come to our countries. And a way of seeking migration, understanding migration, is as a kind of adaptation strategy to these kind of environmental issues. And just a note here from, this is from Professor Jane McAdam, who's one of the key thinkers in this area, just to be careful about scaremongering about all these numbers, because this is something that plays into the hands of those who want to see climate refugees coming and taking over as a kind of security issue. And as I say, the numbers, when you look at the numbers actually coming here, aren't those kind of numbers, and the focus more appropriately anyway should be on the protection of those individuals. And then climate justice is the way into this area in terms of asylum and these people who are more marginalised. And a key kind of concept there is what's been abbreviated to MAPA, so people who are in the most affected people in areas, so to show it's not just a particular part of the world, though definitely more developing states, and definitely because of the emissions of developed states, but also within different areas, different people are affected in different ways. And this is the kind of thing that we've mentioned before, so this is often historically marginalised communities, and it's often communities that have already had the impact of colonialism and extractivism. But these are some definitions of climate justice here, so we can see that's relevant to our issue of asylum. And just bringing in here at the bottom right-hand corner, I don't know how well you can read these on the screen. This is just a quote from the latest IPCC report from this year, linking those two things, so the vulnerability of ecosystems and people to climate change differs, and how it's different in areas where there's marginalisation and historical and ongoing patterns of inequity. So now I'm just going to very quickly go on to ideas to do with the Refugee Convention. So speaking quickly about what is a climate refugee, what do we do with the different definitions that we have in order to try and protect people who are suffering from climate and environmental factors when they seek protection. You may have heard that term, climate refugee, and it's quite a useful term, I think, because it helps people, I think people have an understanding that this is a group of people, perhaps a new group of people, and people who are seeking sanctuary for a particular reason. However, it isn't within the key legal definition definition of what is a refugee. So, and if you look at that here, which hopefully you can see on the screen, you may know that the Refugee Convention has certain very specific categories that you need to fit into to qualify as being a refugee. And that's really partly because of the context in which it was drafted. So this was just straight after the Second World War, when those categories to do with politics, political opinion, religion and nationality were very much to the fore, and very much European concerns were very much to the fore. And what wasn't was this kind of climate or environmental issue. So what you might say then is, well, why don't you just add it? You know, then you've got this group of people that helped. It's clearly a very important category. Why don't you do that? And I think we're all realising, and particularly with this, all the information that's been part of this excellent festival, that the climate emergency is really very real, and actually probably worse, potentially, than a single war. So why don't we do that? Why don't we either add something to the Refugee Convention or create a whole new instrument? And you can see in parallel, in relation to the crime of ecocide, for example, that this is happening there. So there previously been, well, there currently crimes of genocide, for example, that were enacted at about the same time as the Refugee Convention, and now they very much underway is the idea to have a crime of ecocide. So why not do this with refugees? However, it's a lot more complicated than that. And basically, there are lots of reasons why it's thought that that's not going to happen. Partly because when you add in a category, that means that you open up all of the rest. So it may be that some people, well, most people think that that makes the Refugee Convention, which most countries are signed up to, more vulnerable. And also, as we know from our own country, there's absolutely no political will to do that. So what do you do then if you can't add this category to the Refugee Convention or have a whole new convention? And there are some other international mechanisms that are out there that you can look to. For example, there's the Global Compact on Refugees and the Global Compact for Migration. And these are helpful in that they specifically mention climate displacement. And in fact, the Climate Compact on Migration talks about climate change as a unique migration driver. On the other hand, neither of these actually create new legal entitlements. So what we do then is have a look at what exists regionally, and I'm not going to go through the whole world, but there are one or two different ways in which the Refugee Convention works in different parts of the world, which are quite interesting to know about. So in Africa, there's an extension, if you like, to the definition of a refugee in its 1969 OAU Convention, and that's including in that category people who are fleeing events seriously disturbing public order. So there I think you can see that if there's an environmental disaster, that you would be able to use that for climate change, so that's not specifically stated. And I just mentioned a couple of other ways in which climate change is relevant, particularly, as I said initially, because internal displacement is a big thing, so that's covered by the Kampala Convention, and then the others are free movement conventions, so they're not to do with refugee status, but how you might facilitate through other kinds of migration, people moving because of climate change. And this is actually the same in Latin America, so if you look at the Cartagena Declaration, that also includes a definition of people seriously disturbing public order. And that's been followed up by the 2014 Brazil Declaration, specifically in relation to climate change. Now, Europe is quite interesting, and it's also closer to home. And what is, I've just focused on this particular example as something that is food for thought. And this is a report that came out this year from an organisation called Climobile. what it does is it compares the cases of people that come to Europe with these kinds of claims. So they check the claims of people claiming asylum, when they're to do with climate and disaster, and see what happens with the cases. And these countries chosen, Austria and Sweden, are quite interesting because actually Sweden had an additional part of its law which related to being unable to return to the home country because of environmental disaster. So I think this report showed there are those people who are coming to Europe, albeit that they're not identified so far, partly because people don't know where to look. But also interestingly, that actually is what's happened so far, is an issue that's to do with training and lack of knowledge. So although Sweden did have this category, it was hardly ever used either by people who were making their case or by decision makers. And in fact, if you look at the recommendations of the report, then there are a lot of sort of training and guidance recommendations so that people are more able to take advantage of those possibilities. And then just looking at so what might be these claims might be about then this is an example of the kind of range of relevant circumstances that there might be. So it might be whether government withholding or obstructing protection or assistance, to do with provision of humanitarian relief, or maybe refusing to accept aid from other states, or destroying the environment to persecute particular groups of people. Here I think we could think of, for example, the example of Marsh Arabs in Iraq. And there is another couple of categories which are categories more open to development, so where a climate-related impact may meet the threshold of persecution, because it has a differential impact on particular groups, or that the government doesn't establish appropriate measures for prevention of disasters that then also impact people differently. And those can apply equally to non-state agents, with the government being unwilling to unable to provide protection as well. And they're also relevant to what we call internal flight or internal relocation. So other things that have been suggested that you could do with the Refugee Convention are developing or reinterpreting the category of social group, which is actually something which you can remember as one of those categories with politics and religion and so on. And actually, which may be fruitful because the groups which have been created compared to the original groups which were envisioned, it does happen a lot. For example, sexual orientation, thought of as being a group when the Refugee Convention was started, but more recently